Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Omnibus Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, a state representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota. And we're joined, like always, with Walter Hudson, a city councilman from Albertville, and a longtime political activist. And we're here today to interview Dr. Neil Shah, a candidate for governor in the state of Minnesota. So, Dr. Shah, thanks for joining. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself for those listeners who haven't had a chance to meet you?
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity, gentlemen. So my name is Neil Shah. I'm a physician, a father of three, soon to be four kids, a small business owner, and married to my beautiful wife, Sarah, who was born and raised in White Bear Lake. I was born in a suburb of Chicago to Indian immigrant parents who came here about 50 years ago in search of the American dream. They found it. I went to college out east, came to the University of Minnesota for medical school in 2003, did my residency training in dermatology at Mayo Clinic, and then moved back up here to start my practice and start my family 10 years ago. So I currently live in North Oaks. I've lived throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul during my time here, and then down in Rochester for 4 years. I got into this race because I think that the time we have to save our state is running short. I think we're seeing people leave the state for a variety of reasons, all of them very good. And I did not see a candidate on the GOP field or even ones that are coming in that was going to have what it took to get it done against Tim Walz. And I think it's vitally important that we get Walz out of office after one term. I am a younger candidate that looks to bring a lot of energy, looks to defend constitutional conservative values. And I really want to leave this state better than I found it. I want to put it on a footing, on a path to becoming a constitutional conservative state. And I think that that's possible.
Well, thanks for covering our first question too, and usually why you want to run for governor. Is that's really important, and it's also important that you brought up the fact that you don't want to leave the state of Minnesota. I've talked to so many constituents and people across the state who that's really where it's come down to is we have to fix our state quickly before people start leaving, packing up and leaving, or more people pack up and leave because people are already leaving to go to other states. One of the questions I like to ask candidates who are running for governor is, where have you been the past 2 years as we've been dealing with COVID? There's some people that are running now have been out. I've seen them at protests, or they were legislators not doing anything. And what has your experience been during COVID, and what has drawn you into this fight?
So I was just trying to run a practice, trying to raise three little kids, trying to be a good husband. And I think I took a lot of things for granted. I assumed that people at the Capitol with an R after their name were fighting for the same things that I wanted, which was limited government, low taxation. I want the government out of my business, out of my house. I want the government to just get out of the way so that I can prosper. And I just took for granted that that was going to happen. I took for granted that I would have the freedom to have my business open and not have it shut down by a tyrant. I took for granted that Republicans were for fiscal austerity, were for limited government and a limited budget. And the more I started to look into things, the more I realized that I was wrong. And I had taken too much for granted for far too long. I think like many Minnesotans who have become involved in the last year after seeing our freedoms and liberties, the educational prospects of our children and our economic futures put on the line, a lot of people have gotten into the fight that never thought that they would have ever found themselves as activists, whether it was health freedom, whether it's fighting for parental rights and against the scourge of CRT. People are becoming involved at every level, many of whom are around my age, so mid to late 30s, early 40s. And we need to ensure that this class of kind of grassroots activists that have been born because of the struggles of 2020 and 2021 are politically enfranchised. I believe that we are the backbone of the new reinvigorated Republican Party. And I think that all of us who are involved now are coming at the concepts of individual liberty and freedom from different vantage points, but we all want the same thing. And we all realize how damaging a government can be when it runs amok.
Walter, I wanted to give you the next opportunity. Walter and I would chatted a few minutes earlier this week about some of the questions that we would go down in this conversation with you. And we right out of the gate, we realized there's three candidates running who are legislators. There are three candidates running for governor who have no history of no record of voting on laws or bills. And so we wanted to ask you, or actually, I'll let Walter ask the question because you put it really really good. Walter, go ahead.
Well, hopefully we're on the same page as to what question I'm about to ask. But yeah, so I was thinking about it this way earlier today. It's kind of funny as activists, we are very often of dual mind about many things, and one of those things is the nature of our candidates. You know, we're kind of looking for this Frankenstein monster that pieces together all of these qualities that seemingly can't be found in one person. And one example of that is kind of, for lack of a better term, I guess, political pedigree, where um, often we say that we want somebody who is outside the box, an outsider, somebody who's going to shake things up. You know, pick your cliche, somebody who's going to drain the swamp, however you want to phrase it. And then when somebody comes along who we've never heard of before, we're like, well, who's this guy? Where'd he come from? Why now? Why have I never
Right.
heard of him before? And so I guess that's my question is, you know, why now? And you've touched upon this a little bit in your introductory remarks. But where have you been? What have you been doing? And what changed to bring you to really the forefront of political activism? I mean, it doesn't get any bigger than running for an office like governor of the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, I think everyone has their own point where they just hop out of the boiling pot of water. And for me, it was the lockdowns primarily. My business was almost killed, and not just my business, but my patients suffered. So as there was a ban on elective procedures, you know, there's no elective procedure in medicine. I mean, if you've got something, it either hurts or you don't know what it is or you want it fixed, and we're there to fix that. And we had to furlough most of our staff. I mean, we cut all of our expenses as deeply as we could. I was on the rotation, scrubbing the toilets, vacuuming you know, whatever it takes to keep the business afloat. We ended up rebounding, but that's incredibly traumatic. Something you, at that time, had spent 9 years to build and employed 25 people. That's a lot of lives that as a business owner are ultimately your responsibility. And I had to let half those people go, not knowing if I was going to eventually have to let the other half go. And for me, that was the really traumatic moment, that this can never happen again. It was a warning sign that this is all too fragile. It was a warning sign that the Republicans in the legislature, it's not that we had no power, we had the Senate, but where were the votes to end this? And where were the votes to reform the emergency power so this can never, ever happen again? And here we are, we finally ended them, but I don't know, tomorrow if Walz wakes up on the wrong side of his bed, he could do it all again. So that was utterly terrifying to me, to have 9 years of work potentially flushed down the drain by the whims of one man without the imprimatur of the legislature. And I said, this has to happen. So everyone has their different point where they get up onto the boat and start throwing tea into the harbor. For me, that was it. And I was pissed off and I wasn't going to take it anymore. And I looked around and said, this is the time we need to run somebody who can take Walz out, who can show why freedom and liberty are important. And I believe there's a historic opportunity to really dramatically grow our base. Those unifying principles of freedom and liberty are ones that many center and center-left voters feel totally left behind on. Their health freedom's been impinged. Their businesses may have been shut down. They're tired of it, and they want someone who's going to be a champion for those principles.
You've said a couple of times at this point that we needed somebody in this race who was capable of taking on Walz, not just taking him on, but defeating him.
Mm-hmm.
The implied premise there is that you're that guy and that you're uniquely positioned to get the job done in the general election against Walz. What's your case for that? Like, why do you believe that of all the candidates who have stepped up or that are rumored to potentially get in the race at some point, you're the one who, if endorsed and getting past the primary, would have the highest chance of defeating Tim Walz?
We've got 3 former president legislators, so they've had their shot. And what have they done? They've increased government spending during times where it had no business increasing. They continue to enable Walz. They continue to refuse to stand up. For example, Jan Malcolm's a great illustration. Where is the universal condemnation from the Republicans in office of what this woman has done to people in this state? She has no business continuing to occupy her role, and yet she does. And it's not that we're vociferously denouncing her and failing to get her out. We're not even doing that. There should be a press release every day. This woman made monoclonal antibodies too hard to get. This woman continues to prevent physicians from prescribing life-saving drugs. So I want to see some fire in this, and the legislators who have been there have had an opportunity, and either they don't move the footballs down the field, they continue to fund Planned Parenthood, they continue to increase the state budget. I understand in politics, you're not going to get every win, and you may not even get most wins, but at least show us that you are trying. Put the vote down on the right side of history. Put the vote down that the base wants to see. And if you can't get it done, we can't get it done, but at least show us that you believe what we want you to do. So, in terms of the folks who are otherwise in, I think that, or slated to be in, I think the ability to clearly communicate and articulate our values to a base that needs to show up, and also that one that we can grow in terms of the suburbs and disenfranchised Democrats and independents is important. I believe that I'm a clear communicator. That's come across in the debates thus far, and I hope to continue on that trend. And so I think those are the primary features that would allow me to do very well in the general. And I'm also not afraid of, telling the world what Tim Walz has done in very plain spoken terms.
Well, definitely, Neil, you've been I think the best speaker of all the candidates that are running. I'm really impressed with how you carry yourself in the stage and on the stage. I live in the first district, so Tim Walz was my congressman for more than a decade, and he's a very good debater. I was very impressed with how he carried himself in the debate and defended his radical votes. And this, pretends like he's folksy and conservative in a lot of the debates. So I would look forward to seeing you debate him on the stage. One of the things that when you first announced you're running, and I take to Google to figure out who this Neil Shah guy is, I did run across a picture on my Facebook page that I had posted of you years ago, because when I got into the legislature, I ran on bringing price transparency in healthcare. Healthcare is what brought me into the legislature. And I authored a bill with Dr. Jensen to require hospitals have to post certain prices, the cash price, the private insurance price, Medicare and Medicaid pricing, and you came to testify in committee in favor of my bill. So I was scrolling through, I'm like, wow, that's him right there. So I did meet him before, and you were involved legislatively, and you were on the right side of things. So that was good. On healthcare, because I think once COVID goes away and we get back to business, the cost of healthcare is still going to be one of the most important things. The Obamacare is what got me involved in politics in the first place. And I feel like insurance lobbyists and hospital association lobbyists are all complacent in this increasing cost of healthcare. How do we maintain free markets in healthcare while also lowering the cost of healthcare? Is it price transparency and letting people shop outside their traditional networks, or what is your solution? What will you bring to the table from your years of experience in healthcare?
Well, healthcare is one of what I call the three great untouchable swamps in American politics. So the military-industrial complex, education, and healthcare. And they have the most lobbyists, the deepest pockets. And if there's one thing that's going to get you JFK'd, it's going after one of those swamps. Now, what's the last time we had someone in office, particularly at a state executive level, who could clearly articulate exactly how and why the entire healthcare system is nothing resembling a market, but rather a crony cartel setup that enriches a few large hospital systems that get larger by the day through consolidation, and a few healthcare companies at the cost of driving up the input costs of every other company in America, and certainly in the state of Minnesota. What I mean by that is that those healthcare costs are a direct tax on every company. And in fact, if we look at what's happened to people's wages over the last 20 to 30 years, in real terms, the cost of benefits, primarily of health insurance, has so far outstripped the increase in wages that people themselves are paying to subsidize the Mayos, Alinas, Fairviews of the world, and the United Healthcares of the world. And they don't know that. So healthcare is extremely far from being a market where you control your dollars and you have choice in terms of where to go and how to spend them, and you know exactly what you're paying for, but rather a totally obscure black box that takes more and more from individuals, businesses, and the state coffers every year and delivers less and less in return. By any reasonable metric, we're getting less healthy as a population, and yet we spend more and more every year on healthcare expenses. And United Healthcare continues to pay a dividend for the billionth quarter in a row. This is not fair. And so you need someone who's going to go out there and call out Mayo Clinic for consolidating everything in southern Minnesota. The cost of health insurance, if you are a shoemaker in Red Wing, Minnesota, is twice what it is for me in St. Anthony, Minnesota, for the exact same Blue Cross policy. Why? Well, it turns out that when you have a single monopoly, you have a monopoly on pricing power. And the alleged regulatory bodies at the state that are supposed to act as a check on unbridled healthcare and insurance costs have failed to do their job. So the state's not doing it. Consolidation will make this problem worse, and it's going to continue to erode the growth and pay of every Minnesotan, and it's going to continue to erode the bottom line of every other industry in this state that provides health insurance benefits for their employees.
That's an interesting problem to consider, because I don't dispute any of your premises there, but then the question becomes, how do you approach it? And I guess that would be my next question, is because it seems categorically there are two different ways that you could approach it. And without teasing out what my preferred answer would be, what are your thoughts? What are your inclinations as to how to approach this? And obviously you're well positioned professionally to have an informed opinion about how to do that, how to make that happen.
Yeah, so I think that you give the dollars to spend back to the ultimate consumer as much as you can. So I don't like education. So what do? I give the money back to the parents. I don't like healthcare. I want to give it back to the organizations that are either providing health insurance as a service, or ideally back to the actual end recipient of that healthcare, the patient. And then the patient gets to choose where and how they spend those dollars, and they have to know what they're buying and how they're paying for it. And what oftentimes happens, even though the overwhelming majority of medical care is elective, meaning you don't need to decide right now or when you're unconscious what happens to it. It's, I need my knee replaced. Let me find a place to get my knee replaced, and that can happen over the next 2 months. So the majority of healthcare spending is discretionary, or you have time to do that. And oftentimes what the other side will say in this argument is, how are you supposed to decide where you want your care for when you're having a heart attack or stroke? They get mired in that small fraction of spending that's acute care, and they ignore the fact that every joint replacement, colonoscopy, skin check, skin cancer surgery, all of those are really discretionary, and you do have the time to shop. So a policy solution that puts dollars back in the patient's pockets and empowers them to choose the best medical care provider based on their needs would be my preferred solution. And people will also argue that, are you going to get rid of, we have the best healthcare in the world with Mayo Clinic here and the University of Minnesota? No. Just because there's a Kia doesn't mean there's not also a BMW or a Porsche. So people will buy at every level of the market. They just need the opportunity to do so at the lowest relative cost for what they're buying.
So if you win the governor's race, if we have a Republican governor at all, likely we will have a majority of Republicans in the House and Senate. I don't see, it's a pretty slim chance we would have Democrats control legislature and still elect a Republican governor. I've been the chief author of a bill called the Right to Shop Act. Are you familiar with this legislation at all?
To some degree, but please refresh me.
And so the bill is pretty simple. It says that all hospitals and clinics have to publish all of their pricing, and it must be, and they already have this today. It's in this big spreadsheet, right? And so that would be publicly available and consumable by third-party apps, like an app on your phone. And even though you're still in a network, it would allow you to go to get care anywhere, and it would require the insurance company to pay any provider up to what they would have paid in network. And if a consumer saves money, they will receive at least 50% of the savings. So if you want to drive 100 miles to find an MRI that saves you $3,000, the insurance company has to send you a check for $1,500. And so it incentivizes people who want to go shop for care. It doesn't require it, but it incentivizes it, creates competition. It allows independent providers like yourself to offer services and not have to fight to be in network, but you can offer services for cheaper. And people can start shopping for care based on quality of care, the reviews on the provider, and cost as a way to generate more savings. And of course, the other 50% of the savings would go into the insurance pool, which lowers the cost for everyone. So
It's a it's a
it
fantastic
is a
solution.
mandate on businesses. It is a mandate that they have to share the pricing. Insurance companies obviously hate it because their pricing is, protected, and the hospital associations are really against it because so many hospital associations are themselves insurers, and so they're doing this vertical integration to generate more profits, and they don't like it either. But it, I believe, is the correct way to reduce cost. And this type of legislation has been passed in other states and has saved tens of millions of dollars in the first year. The state of Minnesota does a fiscal note to see what my bill would cost, and it said it would cost $12 million to implement because it would generate $12 million in savings or $24 million of savings in the first year just for the state employees that are insured through our policy, and that would have to be paid out. So they saw that as a cost, even though it's an enormous savings in the first year. So is that a type of legislation that you would sign if you were governor?
Absolutely. Anything that allows more market entrance is going to be better for everybody. And so this is my first foray was around the time that I testified in front of your bill. That was the first time that I said something needs to be done to protect independent practice. It gets harder and harder every day to hang your shingle and provide medical services. The power that the insurance companies have is they won't impanel you. So they'll say, we have enough rheumatologists, even though in greater Minnesota, you might have to drive 300 miles to see one and wait 8 months. That's enough. So we don't want you there because the more access there is, the better care people might get and the less they'd have to wait. And they might end up using more healthcare healthcare dollars, which would cut into the dividend for United, say. So anything that allows independent physicians to break away from the big box medical establishment and say, hey, I can provide quality care that's as good or better than any of the big box retailers, and I can do it for a fifth the price. Allow us to compete, and every Minnesotan wins. And it sounds like your bill would do that. And, a piece of legislation that would kind of go hand in hand would be something called any willing provider, which would basically be tied into something like your legislation where they would have to pay, even if you're not in their preferred narrow network, which oftentimes has nothing to do with cost. It simply constrains choice and forces you into occasionally higher paying medical establishments that are larger than allowing me to see my clinic or Scott Jensen's clinic or any of the independent physicians that are still out there trying to make it.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the questions that Walter and I were talking about, and would be good for listeners to learn about you because you weren't a legislator, is what is the checklist that you would use as a governor to determine whether or not this legislation is appropriate for the state of Minnesota? One of the things I see as a legislator, and this comes from both parties, is people get really emotional when they have people come and testify, whether it's the hands-free bill, which I opposed, because there's so much emotion in a lot of this legislation. And so legislators kind of step back and say, well, gosh, the majority of people want it and they pass it, even though, my checklist is it the proper role of government? Is there a better, more private solution that would be more efficient? And does this grow government? All this kind of things. What is your moral rubric, as Walter said, or what is your checklist on whether or not you think legislation should be signed into law or vetoed?
Right. So I would go back to, is this an enumerated power? Is this one of the limited things the government ought to be doing? We can talk about keeping the roads open and criminal justice and keeping our streets safe. Great, right? Then the second question is this doing that role as efficiently as possible? So are we shrinking departments and making them more efficient, or are we increasing administrative bloat? Are we increasing regulations or reducing regulations? Are we getting the hand of government out of people's homes, out of their businesses, or increasing it? The hands-free bill that you mentioned, sometimes it's hard for people to understand that violates individual liberty. And that's why that bill ought to be opposed. It's an infringement on personal freedom, even though they'll trot someone out and say, a distracted driver killed my loved one. None of us want that. But infringing on individual freedoms and liberties isn't going to change that fact. And a lot of times that type of wrong-headed reasoning finds its way into the gun control debate, that if we somehow penalize individuals who are law-abiding citizens who've never committed a crime and have no intent to commit a crime, but follow the law, that we're somehow going to improve the rate of gun violence from people who, by definition, do not follow the law. So that's the general rubric that I'm going to use. I want government to get smaller. I want laws to come off the books. I want government to be lean, and I want individual freedom to be as robust as possible.
So when you're weighing individual liberty and what government should and shouldn't do, especially when we're talking about protecting people from themselves, where do you stand on cannabis, whether from medical cannabis or personal use?
So I've seen too many patients that are either combat veterans or patients struggling with cancer pain, or patients that were having debilitating pain treated with narcotics or other psychoactive medications prescribed by physicians who've been helped by cannabis. So I think that it has a medical use. I do not think that you need to ask the government or even a physician for permission to take care of yourself. And so I support decriminalization of marijuana. I do not support full legalization. I think decriminalization allows the folks who have been helped by that to continue to be helped by it. And it is something that I would very much support. And I think that the majority of the population has kind of come around to seeing that it does have its uses and is significantly better. If my choice is having a patient on fentanyl for life or oxy for life, or occasionally using marijuana, that one's an easy one from a medical standpoint.
Okay. And one of the bills that we debated in the legislature was whether or not the state should ban licensed practitioners, so licensed therapists and doctors, from advertising therapy that would convert people who thought they were gay back to being straight. And it was very contentious. The House passed the legislation. Gazelka refused to pick it up in the Senate. I thought of a really simple solution, that we should amend the bill to say not only can you not advertise a medical service of converting someone to be straight, but that you also should not be able to practice medicine in injecting children with hormones to convert their gender. So this would only be for minors. It wouldn't be for all, for adults, but it would be for minors and vulnerable adults. What's your stance on that bill or proposed amendment that would prevent people from transitioning children, youth especially, to another gender?
Yeah, I mean, in the side of individual liberty, people are going to make choices that I vehemently disagree with. And I think that we can draw a bright line at 18 in terms of kind of the transition things. It's completely inappropriate with the decision of the parents below that age. And I have a hard time saying that, even though I think it's a very bad decision for parents to make those permanent choices, it has to go the other way. And you have to say, look, there's parental rights. And so if you support parental rights to decide to not vaccinate, to decide to withhold medical treatment for what could potentially be a life-saving procedure, then you unfortunately have to end up on the side of medical rights for a transition that I think is foolhardy. Once you're 18, individual liberty, people are free to smoke cigarettes, even though it's a stupid idea. So I would support their right to do that. I don't think taxpayer dollars should go to it. I would say that you shouldn't do it in many cases. We can certainly have a longer discussion about what the science actually shows in terms of detransitioners and some resources for your listeners on that question. But I think certainly for kids, it's not something that the state should support and the state should pay for. But the other side of that, the conversion therapy, look, I mean, I don't agree with it, but I'm going to have a hard time restricting somebody's practice from doing something, provided that both parties actually know what they're getting into and are able to consent. And that ends up being the difficult thing, is if parties can both consent and the only potential harm is accrued to that individual and they've reached the age of maturity, people are free to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a couple questions that are kind of related, and they both have to do with persuasion and your role as a candidate and as a potential governor in having to persuade, because that's what this business is. And so I guess the first one would be on the election side of things. You often hear the case made, the conventional wisdom is that in order to get an endorsement for a party and run in the primary, you have to throw red meat to the base and say all the right things and, get past that hurdle of being endorsed and winning the primary. But then when it comes time for the general, it's time to pivot. It's time to moderate. It's time to hold your cards close to your vest in order to cross the general election threshold. My question is whether or not you subscribe to that conventional wisdom, and related to it, how you intend to persuade people who are outside of our bubble, the Republican bubble, the conservative bubble, that it's time for a change. It's time to do something that the state hasn't done in decades.
So the first part of that, I think it's a mistake to pivot. I think you can phrase things in a way that for first-time listeners, they will have an easier time understanding why it is that I carry a pistol every day, why it is that I believe in the Second Amendment, why it is that critical race theory is fundamentally flawed and evil. So you have to bring those folks in a general over, but I don't think you get squishy on what it is that you believe, which is the Second Amendment ought to be preserved and defended, that critical race theory must go away. And I think that this mistaken concept that you have to become squishy and pivot and milquetoast is the reason we continue to lose. And I think that the empiric data to support that assertion is from Virginia. So Glenn Youngkin was a down-the-line conservative, pro-life from conception, anti-critical race theory, very upfront about how he felt about all of those issues. And I don't think you could assail him to say that he was moderate in the least. He was conservative. And that's a state that, in terms of its voting, looks an awful lot like Minnesota, with a large metro area dominating quite red greater Minnesota, greater Virginia. So he didn't back away from those principles. He stood for them, because I think that the majority of people, center left and moderate and independent voters who are going to decide this election, those people all have friends with whom they disagree on issues. What they are going to select for is someone that they believe will govern in an ethical manner, that will put a set of core principles, in my case, freedom, liberty, economic prosperity, and safety, above all other considerations, will vote based on their conscience and what they said they were going to do, and won't vote based on what special interests or so-called party leadership want them to do. And I think if you do those things, those people will vote for you, even though on 20% of the issues they disagree. But the reality is, all Americans want safe streets. They want schools that educate, that not indoctrinate. They want businesses that pay them a good wage, and they want a state that they can be proud to live in. We agree on far more than we think, than the mainstream or legacy media would have us believe that we disagree on. Minnesotans are quite similar in terms of what they want, and we can't be riven by a legacy media that makes money driving us apart. So if you can show people that you're honest, you're going to stand for a certain set of things, many of which resonate with them, I think that they will vote for you in the general election.
The second question along the same theme addresses what happens after election day. You're governor now. You've got the job. You're tasked with making your agenda happen. You've already spoken to the fact that there's a lot of resistance, institutional resistance. You might refer to it as Minnesota's version of the deep state, the established bureaucracy, the established lobbying forces, and of course, incumbent longtime legislators in both parties who are doing just fine with the way things are and don't really necessarily want or need to see any kind of dramatic change in the status quo. How do you persuade those people to get with the program and go along with the changes that you're advocating for, which, to go back to the cliche, certainly rock the boat?
So I think you can start them off with some pretty easy wins that shouldn't be all that controversial. Hey, day one, I want to strip all of my emergency powers and give them to you. What politician doesn't want more power? Here, take it. If you can't get that passed, it's going to be a problem. So that's something I take very seriously. That emergency powers reform, the never again legislation, has to pass. I don't see that being a problem because, as you said, we will have the House, the Senate, and the governorship. Okay. What's the next thing we can agree on? Education. Let's get those dollars back in people's pockets. That is going to be popular with moderate and independent voters and even some center-left voters that are tired of failing school districts and teachers' unions that put themselves above both the students and the teachers themselves. So we can get those two big wins under our belt, and then maybe people will start to understand that the reason they're in St. Paul is to move, if you're conservative, is to move the conservative football down the field. And there's going to be a cost to that. The cost is that you will not be in power forever. The only thing a prevent defense prevents is victory. And we are going to take some lumps by doing things that stand up for those conservative values, for making the difficult decision and cutting the budget 5%, reducing taxes, reining in the administrative state. None of those are going to be popular with the swamp, which is going to fight back. None of those are going to be popular with the DFL, which is going to fight back. You have to convince these folks to hold the line, and you have to make them realize that they are there to serve, not be served. They're there to advance the conservative football down the field. And yes, some of them will get chucked out of office. And yes, we will lose power. But did we do the things that we could do while we had it in a meaningful way that will put Minnesota on a better footing long term? And I tell you, if you do that a few cycles in a row, I think that 2 out of every 3 major cycles we could control over time. And that means that we are slowly, gradually advancing that football down the field. And that's what the DFL has done to us for the last 40 years. They get in, they get power, they move their football, they get chucked out. We do nothing. The next time they're in, they keep doing it. Time to learn from our opponent. They've been very successful in that way. We need to go that same way. But it means that you have to have a set of core principles that you're willing to fight for and defend. And you need to put the needs of the state above the needs of your so-called political career.
It's one thing that Walter and I discuss often is when Republicans had all 3 branches of government, or all, the White House and both the House and Senate in DC. They campaigned on eliminating Obamacare. They came into office and they cowered. They got weak because they wanted to maintain power. I would love nothing more than to have a one-term governor, Republican governor, that could get in there and make so much change so quickly that there's just no way that we can withstand the tsunami coming at us in 2 years to take back majorities in the House and Senate. But that's great. I want to cover a couple of things that have been out there on social media about you, kind of playing a fact check here. When you announced you're running, I go and I set up Google alerts. So I search for your name, and anytime Neil Shah appears in the news, I get an email with links to that news article. And I get about 6 or 7 of them a day, and they're not you. They're other Neil Shahs. Turns out Neil Shah is a very common name. So one of the things that we saw right away was that Neil Shah was a big donor to Democrats. When I looked at the CFB report, I saw that Neil Shah donated to the chairs of all of the health committees, both Democrat and Republican, because we're controlled by both ends of the governor. And that makes sense because I know a lot of industry groups tell you who to donate to and who to write checks to. But then there's some other things out there saying that Neil Shah donated to Act Blue and Bernie Sanders. Can you talk about these donations?
Yeah. So, Neil Shah, it's not like an episode of Highlander. There is more than one. And in fact, when I was at Mayo, there were 3 of us. And we all had a drink before we left because we used to get each other's lab results and patient correspondence. And so, so I'll be clear about what my contributions are. So I give to my professional society PAC in DC. So that's called Skin PAC. You'll see that on FEC, but not CFP filing since it's a national thing. At the state level, I've given money to Kurt Dowd and Senator Gazelka, and also to Tim Walz. That was around that era that we were trying to talk to both sides to get any willing provider legislation passed. But then there is a Neil Shah that lives in Bloomington that likes to give money to Bernie Sanders and Act Blue, and that is definitely not me. And what it's either one of the other campaigns or it's DFL disinformation. They cut out the column that shows employer because you have to list your employer and then address. And so it looks like a Neil Shah gives to all these things, but if you actually click on the CFB report, you can see that they're clearly different folks with totally different patterns of it. And in fact, there's many Neil Shahs around the country. So if you go outside the state of Minnesota, the overwhelming majority, unfortunately, are liberals, but there are a few conservatives out there. So no, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that. And in fact, that was something from the beginning that we didn't hide. Did you donate to Tim Walz? Yeah, I did. And I regret trying to think that the swamp could be changed. And that's part of the reason why I'm here today. The swamp doesn't care. on either side of the aisle. If you're an independent person, they're going to take that money from the hospitals, and they're going to take that money from the insurers, and they could give two hoots about whether an independent medical practice could make it. But absolutely no money to Bernie, and I'm a proud Trump voter. So yeah, it was that's a bizarre hit piece. And the other thing too that was that even the legacy media knew about the Walz thing from the beginning, and this one, they were like, no, that's fake news. It's a different Neil Shah. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that, because it certainly is a Steele dossier disinformation piece that's out there.
Yeah, thanks for that. The other question I had that's come up is about your wife. I believe she ran for city council or something, and was asked if Tim Walz's response to COVID was appropriate or something like that. And I couldn't find the exact quote, but my understanding is that she supported or agreed that his response to COVID was appropriate. And there's no requirement that your spouse be Republican or Democrat. In fact, having people's, my wife gives me a lot of advice on legislation too, but it's nice to hear all perspectives. But can you explain that to the listeners on what the quote was and why?
So it was about the initial response to COVID. And so the initial response to the first 2 weeks, no one knew what it was. I mean, if someone's shooting at you, taking a knee and looking around is not a bad idea. Then obviously after that, that's when the response really went bad from Tim Walz. So I think that was I think the quote's actually, the whole interview's out there. So you can actually search for it. And it's a pretty short one-liner response. Sarah's very conservative, so we're both kind of on the same boat politically. And we both knew. It's been interesting. She serves on city council, has for about 5 years here in North Oaks. It's been interesting to see kind of the fake news machine spin up. Someone found a Sarah Wells, which is her maiden name, who's like a radical leftist in some other place, and cut a picture of, this is Shah's wife and she's pro this and pro that. And so, we knew that getting into it, that it would be like this. And if you're not taking fire, you're not over the target. So it's been interesting to see a lot of this spin up since that strong performance at the debate, where we called out Senator Gazelka's record and kind of put people on notice that, hey, we're not going to play nice here and roll over. We're going to try to win this thing and put the state on a better footing. And since that time, we've seen these attacks occur, and I'm sure they'll continue to do so as we proceed in the election.
Okay, Walter, what do you have for last questions for Neil?
Well, you've covered a lot of territory, and you've answered questions in ways that provide answers to other questions that we didn't even ask. So I very much appreciate that. And it doesn't leave a whole lot left to probe about. So I will just ask for kind of like your status of where the campaign's at. As I said, as an activist, I've been in and around the Republican Party for over a decade, and when somebody comes along who we've never heard of before, ears perk up and we go, huh, who's that? I wonder what this is. So, you've got this steep incline in terms of name recognition and getting your name out there and introducing yourself to people. How do you perceive that has been going, and how are you feeling going into caucuses in just under a month here, or over a month here?
Well, yeah, it's been a steep educational process in a very short amount of time. I mean, this spring, I didn't think I would be here this time of year. And it was only when I looked at the folks who were running or going to run that I said, I don't think we're going to pull this off, and we have to. Walz has to go. So I've learned a lot. I mean, I knew very little about the entire process coming into it, the landscape, how the party functioned. That's been an asset in some ways, to look at it with fresh eyes and say, well, I think we could be doing this a lot better, or, this is why we've been losing for so long. And it's definitely been an instructional process. It was brutal this fall to make all those phone calls and have people be like, who are you? And why are you doing this? And that over time has gone away. So now when you call someone, they're like, yeah, I've heard of you. And we generally have strong favorables and low unfavorables, which I think is really good. So as we move into the caucus season, I think we're positioned in a place and resourced adequately to be there in Rochester seeking the endorsement. I will abide by that endorsement. I've said that in the beginning. I thought maybe there's a path. There just isn't. Without the endorsement, that's it. And I'm going to support whoever gets it. But we are in a good position to make a strong run at that. I think there's a large appetite amongst both the grassroots and people who have been involved with the party for some time, of wanting something different, of understanding that we run the same folks, the same personality types, the same party insiders. They get squishy at the wrong time. They can't take the fight to the other side. They can't stand up and articulate why we have a plan to make things better, why we won't just attack, but we can actually provide something constructive to the people of Minnesota and how we'll govern. And I think that that's an opportunity that will continue to grow. So I think we're in a good place, but you're right. It's still an uphill climb when people don't know who you are, when the other side is saying, we've done all these great things, we'll continue to do them. And we're asking people to trust me, to take it on faith that here's a guy who has something else to do, but thinks this is important enough that it's worth putting all those things aside, my practice, taking time away from my kids and my wife to do this work. And I think that this work absolutely has to be done. And this is the time to get a historic win and really move conservative values down the field in this state.
Well, great. Thank you, Neil, for answering all of our questions. And I'm sure the listeners will want to hear more from you as you're out on the campaign trail. I put out on my Facebook page, and I've got a pretty sizable reach of over 40,000 people. I put a poll out there with all the candidates plus Kendall Qualls, because I knew he was going to run, and asked people to weigh in on who they support. And you and Jensen were in the top spots. So
That's great.
I think that you align. Out of all the candidates, you align with my political philosophy probably the closest. I've worked with Dr. Jensen a lot in the legislature, but it's I think the people that follow me on Facebook are big fans of you, and we hope to see more of you out there on the campaign trail. And caucuses are coming up in a month, so people want to get out and caucus for Dr. Shah. I'm sure they can reach out to your website, which is electneil.com.
That's right. Electneil.com. Shoot us a message on there. If you go to volunteer, you can there's a pathway in there you can select to go through the caucus thing. We have trainings every weekend. We'll get you through it. We have so many first-time caucus goers who are like, I really like you. I like this mission, but I've never done this before. Don't worry. We'll help you get through it. And I appreciate you. I agree that it sounds like we're both constitutional conservatives. We believe in the same things, and I appreciate the vote of support. And I think that poll is telling. I think both of us are in ways outsiders. Scott served for a bit and has, those votes that he's going to have to answer for or explain. But we certainly aren't entrenched longtime party insiders. And I think that shows you that there's a real appetite out there for something different and for real, true, meaningful victory here in Minnesota.
Yeah, and I want to add one more segment to this. The question that's come up to me a lot as I'm out talking about candidates and mention your name, and that's your relation to Action for Liberty. As I know that I ran for office, and when the establishment came at me, Action for Liberty came out and helped me in my bid for getting the endorsement, helped me make phone calls and organize and ask questions. And their assistance of my campaign quadrupled the establishment's attack on me. And so it was like, I'll take help from anybody, but my association with them, because they're so harsh on, establishment politicians, brought about more attacks from me. So as I'm talking to delegates out there and they say, well, is that the Action for Liberty candidate? My initial reaction is, I think he aligns with what a lot of the things they believe in, what I believe in, but he's not, as far as I know, the Action for Liberty candidate. They didn't, recruit you, but can you explain your relationship with that group?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, we align on ideas. They're freedom and liberty focused people. I'm a freedom and liberty guy. And so they don't endorse candidates. I'm not their candidate. I certainly support what they've done, particularly in terms of giving grassroots people a home. What's the Republican Party done in this state to enfranchise all of these grassroots activists, particularly the whole new crop of them that were born out of the problems of 2020 and 2021? Those people don't feel enfranchised. And if you go to something that's a very insider event, like the state central convention or even the statewide convention, in Rochester, it doesn't feel like a process that invites new people to become involved, That has to change. And I think for many folks, Action for Liberty has provided a home, a place to feel heard. I think that they have certainly pushed people in the right direction. They're unfairly maligned for only going after, Republicans that get squishy. I think that they were the folks who actually really put their thumb on the scale in terms of getting the emergency powers ended by pressuring vulnerable DFLers in greater Minnesota. But they're a confrontational politics outfit. I mean, not to get too far into the weeds, but this is how the left has moved politicians in the direction that they've wanted. And successful conservative activist groups like Gun Owners of America have practiced the same thing to move conservative politicians in the direction they want. And so when you have these folks that have an R after their name, but are voting almost indistinguishably from people with a DFL after their name, I think those people do have to be held to account. And I've said repeatedly that simply being a Republican doesn't necessarily mean you're a conservative. I'm a conservative. I would like to cajole people. I think that you can't get confrontational about everything. I'd like to explain to people why I'd like them to vote for the side of freedom and liberty. But if they're immune to those arguments, if they want to have an R after their name, they do need to stand for some of our core principles, or they need to join a different party. And I think that upsets the party establishment that likes to think that they're the kingmakers, that they're the only people who can be the arbiters of what is Republican or conservative thought in this state. So I appreciate the opportunity to clarify there. I think sometimes that makes people who've been involved with the party kind of scared. And I've certainly been very direct with people that I don't think are representing conservative values in St. Paul. And, if that offends people, well, it's going to offend people, but it's about standing up for those principles, not standing up for people's individual careers.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I've worked with Action for Liberty quite a bit and North Star Liberty Alliance, and I know that Action for Liberty's had a scorecard, and every year I've been on the cover because I vote the same way that they believe in. And I just, even though they've been attacking me as late, I just donated to them last month. So, bought a bunch of tickets to their annual dinner. So I do believe what they believe in. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to clarify it. Most of the opposition coming from or against Action for Liberty is from sitting legislators, because that's who obviously they're hard on. And legislators don't like to be criticized by conservatives, but I think it's most of the time it's deserved. So yeah, thanks for that. Well, again, Jip, I think we've covered a lot in this interview, but you get 30 seconds. You want to wrap it up, Dr. Shah?
Well, I just appreciate the opportunity to share my message, the opportunity to chat with you guys. I think, Jeremy, you're doing amazing work in the legislature. I want more folks like you there that are there to serve a set of ideals, that are there to serve conservative principles and to get those things done. As governor, I want to provide the cover fire that allows you to get those legislation pieces onto my desk so I can sign them. I'm happy taking the hits from NPR and the Red Star Tribune and all the rest of the legacy establishment. That's the job of a good executive, and then to provide cover for you to get that legislation to me. So I really feel excited about where Minnesota is at. I think this is our time as conservatives in this state to reinvigorate the Minnesota GOP, to put it on a footing that will be successful for the next few decades, and to put Minnesota back onto a path of prosperity, liberty, safety. And I feel very excited about being able to do all those as your governor. So thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
All right. And that wraps up another session of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.